February 1945. The island of Luzon lies in silence after weeks of shellfire. Smoke coils from shattered palms. A faint breeze carries the smell of antiseptic and burned canvas, what remains of a Japanese field hospital. Inside the ruins, half buried in ash, a group of young nurses huddle together. Their uniforms are torn, faces streaked with dirt and fear. For years they've been told the same story, that capture means torture, that Americans will show no mercy. One clutches a shard of glass, ready to end her life before the enemy arrives. Then, footsteps, heavy, measured, and closer. The door creaks open, sunlight spilling in over broken walls. Instead of rifles, the soldiers carry stretchers. Instead of chains, blankets. One American medic kneels, wrapping a trembling nurse in warmth. She resists at first, sobbing, expecting cruelty. But none comes. In that frozen moment, the war's fiercest propaganda collapses into silence. The nurses weep, not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of unexpected kindness. That moment, recorded quietly in field diaries and medical reports, became one of the war's rarest truths, that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could still disarm fear. The Pacific War was unlike any other front of World War II. It was not only a clash of armies, it was a collision of worlds. On one side stood the United States, fighting a modern industrial war powered by steel, oil, and democracy. On the other stood Imperial Japan, driven by discipline, emperor worship, and a warrior code that turned death itself into a virtue. By 1944, the tide had begun to turn. The American island-hopping campaign had sliced through the Pacific, capturing key positions one by one. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam. Each victory came at a brutal cost. Yet behind the gunfire and the flames, a deeper battle was being fought. A psychological war of perception built on propaganda, fear, and cultural misunderstanding. Japanese soldiers and civilians alike had been raised under a relentless message: the Americans are beasts. Schoolbooks, radio broadcasts, and government pamphlets painted them as monsters who slaughtered prisoners and violated women. The state-run news showed doctored images of supposed atrocities, claiming surrender was worse than death. For young Japanese nurses, most of them barely in their 20s, this belief became survival instinct. They carried cyanide tablets in their pockets, vowing never to be captured alive. When the Americans stormed Saipan in June 1944, those fears reached a tragic climax. Hundreds of civilians and nurses, terrified by lies, leapt from the cliffs of Marpy Point into the sea. American soldiers, horrified, tried shouting in broken Japanese, waving their arms to stop them, but the mistrust was absolute. To the Japanese, surrender was dishonor. To the Americans, the suicides were incomprehensible. The U.S. military soon realized that firepower alone would not win the Pacific. They needed to shatter the empire's psychological armor. Alongside bombs and bullets came leaflets dropped from aircraft, promising humane treatment and medical care for those who surrendered. Loudspeakers broadcast messages from captured Japanese soldiers, urging their comrades to live. The aim was simple: to replace fear with doubt. By late 1944, as battles raged across Leyte and the Philippines, American field medics began encountering something new: surrendering Japanese personnel, wounded, frightened, but alive. Among them were nurses from the Japanese Army and Navy Medical Corps, trained under the Red Cross emblem but forbidden to trust the enemy. Their surrender often came after days of hiding, starving, and waiting for the inevitable bullet that never came. What they met instead were men in olive-drab uniforms, carrying morphine, bandages, and water canteens. To the Americans, the oath to heal the wounded knew no nationality. To the Japanese, such behavior defied everything they had been taught. This contrast between myth and reality, hatred and compassion, formed one of the quietest yet most powerful turning points of the Pacific War. It revealed that beneath the uniform, beneath the propaganda, there remained a common humanity that neither empire nor ideology could fully erase. And as the war pushed closer to Japan's homeland, those small moments of mercy would begin to multiply. Quietly, almost invisibly, changing the way both sides saw each other. The next chapter of this story begins there, as the final year of war dawned, and compassion began to pierce the fog of battle. As 1945 dawned, the Pacific War entered its final, most desperate stage. Japan's empire was crumbling. The U.S. Navy had cut off supply routes. Bombers now reached Tokyo itself. Yet on every island still held by Japanese forces, resistance hardened. Every soldier, every medic, every nurse was told to fight or die trying. When American forces landed on Luzon in January 1945, the scale of destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Cities lay in ruin. Civilians were trapped between two armies. Hospitals were shattered under artillery fire. And yet, deep inside caves, schools, and makeshift tunnels, Japanese nurses continued their duty, treating the wounded with dwindling supplies, bloodied hands, and no hope of relief. Many had already written farewell letters, believing their fate sealed. The Imperial Army's indoctrination was absolute. Manuals instructed medics on death etiquette. Surrender was shameful, mercy was weakness, and compassion toward the enemy was treason. Even the nurses, bound by the emblem of the Red Cross, were reminded that their ultimate loyalty was to the Emperor, not humanity. But as American troops advanced, their reality began to unravel. The expected brutality never came. Instead, loudspeakers echoed through the jungle. "Lay down your arms! You will not be harmed. Medical personnel will be treated with respect." Leaflets fluttered through the trees, showing illustrations of captured Japanese nurses receiving medical aid. Many dismissed them as lies, yet a few began to wonder. In February, American medics from the 37th Infantry Division discovered one of the first hidden field hospitals near the town of Bamban. Inside were wounded soldiers, a few doctors, and nearly 20 Japanese nurses. Their supplies were gone. Their uniforms were stained with mud and blood. Expecting execution, they bowed in silence. Instead, the Americans offered food, bandages, and morphine. One nurse later wrote in her diary, "They gave me warm soup. I cried. I had never seen an enemy show such gentleness." Stories like these began to circulate quietly among Japanese survivors. They contradicted everything imperial propaganda had preached for years. Some officers threatened those who surrendered, warning they would be shamed forever. But others, seeing their patients saved by American medics, began to question what they had fought for. By the time the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa erupted, the psychological war was already shifting. American soldiers were instructed to treat enemy wounded whenever possible. The U.S. Army Medical Corps' motto, "To conserve fighting strength," expanded into something broader, to conserve life itself. For Japanese nurses, this realization arrived like a wound and a healing at once. They had spent years preparing to die for an emperor they would never see, only to be saved by an enemy they had never met. Their tears in captivity were not only of relief, but of confusion. How could kindness exist amid such hatred? It was in these quiet, overlooked encounters, far from generals, far from headlines, that the Pacific War's truest transformation occurred. Because mercy, once shown, spreads. And by the time Japan would face its surrender later that year, the seeds of reconciliation had already been planted, not in treaties or speeches, but in the simple act of an American soldier wrapping a shivering nurse in a blanket. War is often measured in numbers. How many ships sank? How many soldiers died? How many cities burned? But the true story of the Pacific War also lies in the silent gestures that never made it to headlines. The trembling hand offering water to a wounded enemy. The medic who paused under fire to stop the bleeding of a stranger. The nurse who, after years of indoctrination, realized her captors had more mercy than her commanders. From the American side, these acts were not random. They were rooted in training, discipline, and the Geneva Convention, values designed to hold humanity together when everything else collapsed. Every medic carried two burdens: to save life and to witness death. They were not warriors. They were caretakers walking through hell. In the Philippines, Burma, and the Marianas, medics risked their own lives to reach enemy wounded. They treated Japanese soldiers, civilians, even nurses, because the oath to heal knew no borders. The tactical side of mercy was also real. By 1944, American military intelligence had recognized that showing humane treatment could break the cycle of suicidal resistance. The more Japanese troops and civilians saw compassion, the more likely they were to surrender. Saving a wounded nurse was not only moral, it was strategic. Each life spared carried a message stronger than any loudspeaker. The enemy you fear is not the monster you were told. Yet for the Japanese nurses, the emotional shift was almost unbearable. They had lived under a system that fused medicine with militarism. Healing was patriotic. Dying with honor was sacred. Many had served since the early years of the war in China, watching young men die for slogans of loyalty and glory. Compassion was a private act, hidden behind the uniform. To show emotion, to weep, was seen as weakness. When capture finally came, and instead of torture they found care, their world cracked open. A nurse later recalled that she could not meet the eyes of the American medic who bandaged her wounds. "He smiled," she wrote, "and I wished he would not. It was too gentle. It hurt." For the U.S. medics, the shock ran the other way. They had seen the horrors of Bataan and Guadalcanal, mutilated prisoners, fanatical charges, suicide rather than surrender. They expected hatred. Yet, when they carried Japanese nurses on stretchers, when they heard them whisper thanks in broken English, it became something few soldiers were prepared for: empathy for the enemy. Tactically, it created ripples through the front lines. Intelligence officers noted that news of humane treatment spread through Japanese ranks despite censorship. Prisoners began surrendering more frequently in small groups. Each rescue, each moment of mercy, was a quiet battle won, not by bullets, but by trust. But on the ground, it was never simple. Not every American soldier shared that compassion. In the chaos of war, atrocities occurred on both sides. Some medics were shot while treating Japanese wounded. Some nurses were caught in crossfire despite surrendering. The line between mercy and survival was razor thin. And yet, even within that uncertainty, there existed a fragile understanding. A human recognition that no uniform could erase. At field stations on Leyte, at Red Cross shelters in Manila, and later across Okinawa's cliffs, these interactions multiplied. Photographs taken by war correspondents show scenes that words can barely contain. A young Japanese nurse lying on a stretcher, her face pale, an American hand steadying her pulse. Another nurse helping an American medic distribute water to wounded Japanese prisoners. Each frame captured not propaganda, but something deeper: the quiet erosion of hatred. These moments did not end the war. They did not stop the bombs or the bloodshed, but they began to rewrite the moral balance of it. Because even as one side sought total victory, the individuals on both sides, medics and nurses, rediscovered something their governments had buried under slogans and fear: the instinct to save, not destroy. And that instinct, fragile as it was, began to travel across battlefields, through rumors, reports, and captured diaries, shaping a new understanding of what it meant to fight, and what it meant to remain human. If bullets shaped the battlefield, propaganda shaped the mind. In the Pacific War, no weapon was more deeply embedded than fear. From the earliest campaigns in China to the last days in Okinawa, both sides waged a psychological war that reached into every home, every classroom, every newspaper. It was a war of stories, and stories, once believed, can kill more efficiently than bombs. For Imperial Japan, propaganda was survival. The military regime knew that the moment its people stopped believing, the empire would collapse. Civilians were told the Americans were demons, Kichiku Beye, brutal Anglo-American devils. Leaflets described horrific fates awaiting women and children if captured. Nurses in training were shown staged films of American atrocities. In these distorted images, the enemy was no longer human. This fear bound the nation in obedience, even as defeat loomed. That is what made the American acts of compassion so devastating, not to the enemy's body, but to its ideology. Each captured nurse, treated with care, became a living contradiction. Her survival was proof that the empire's most sacred lies were false. The U.S. Army understood this power. By 1945, its psychological warfare branch had begun compiling testimonies and photographs of humane treatment, Japanese POWs eating well, Nurses receiving medical attention, civilians helped by GIs. These were quietly broadcast through captured radio channels and printed in Japanese language leaflets dropped over remaining garrison. One such leaflet showed a photograph of an American medic dressing a Japanese nurse's wound, with a caption that read, "Surrender is not shame. Life is still loyalty." It was subtle, yet revolutionary. The Empire had told its people that to live was betrayal. The Americans were saying that to survive was courage. For the nurses who lived through these encounters, the moral impact was profound. Diaries recovered after the war speak, in a voice rarely heard in military archives, the voice of women who realized too late that they had been deceived. One wrote, "When they covered us with blankets, I felt more defeated than ever, not by arms, but by mercy." Another entry from a hospital aide on Leyte read, "I prayed to die before capture. Now I pray that my mother will know the enemy was kind." These are not the words of propaganda. They are confessions, raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. They reveal that the breaking of myths often hurts more than the breaking of armies. From a moral perspective, the Americans too were changed. Soldiers who had fought through the horrors of Guadalcanal and Tarawa began to see the Japanese not as faceless fanatics, but as fellow sufferers of their own government's lies. Chaplains wrote about moments when medics asked for extra blankets for captured nurses, saying, "They would have done the same for us." Whether that was true or not hardly mattered. The act of believing it was enough to restore a sense of balance in a world gone mad. In the long run, these quiet moral victories mattered more than any leaflet or headline. When the war ended, Japan's reconstruction was built not only on surrender, but on understanding. And that understanding began long before Tokyo's formal capitulation. It began in jungles, caves, and burned hospitals, where compassion quietly challenged the propaganda of hate. Historians later called it the soft victory, a triumph not of armies, but of empathy. It was the realization that mercy, when shown at the height of war, carries a power that no government can predict or control. And as the Pacific battles drew to their final blood-soaked chapters, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, that power, fragile but persistent, would rise again in moments few noticed, yet none forgot. Because, in the end, propaganda can command belief, but only compassion can change. Okinawa, April 1945, the last great battle before Japan itself. Rain fell in sheets over the ridges of Shuri Line. The 2D ground was churned into mud by tanks and blood. American flamethrowers lit up the caves that dotted the island's limestone hills, while Japanese soldiers and civilians hid together underground. Among them were nurses from the Japanese Army's field medical unit. They had run out of morphine. They tore their own bandages into strips. Some still whispered prayers to the emperor, though their faith trembled with every explosion. For days, the Americans advanced inch by inch. The Japanese fought like ghosts. Then, somewhere near Hebaru village, the shooting stopped long enough for a small patrol of U.S. medics to approach a cave flagged with a white cloth. The men hesitated. Traps were common, surrender a trick. Yet from the shadows emerged not soldiers, but women in torn white uniforms. Their faces were hollow, their hands raised. Behind them lay dozens of wounded, both Japanese and civilian. The Americans lowered their rifle. One medic stepped forward, holding his palms out. "Nurse?" he asked. A faint nod. What followed became one of the most quietly documented encounters of the Pacific War. The medics carried the nurses out, one by one. Some were too weak to walk. They had expected execution. Instead, they were given water, bandages, and warm blankets. One nurse, delirious with fever, whispered, "Why?" The medic didn't answer. He simply tightened the blanket around her shoulders. Nearby, an American war correspondent named Robert Sherrod recorded the aftermath. He wrote, "They had believed we would humiliate them, but the only thing we gave them was warmth. I saw one of them weeping so silently it broke the air itself." The story reached the rear lines within hours. It was passed from medic to infantryman, from soldier to correspondent. For the Americans, it was a moment of redemption, a glimpse that humanity could survive even here, in the mud and smoke of Okinawa. For the Japanese nurses, it was an emotional collapse. They had been told the enemy was incapable of compassion. Now, as they sat wrapped in the blankets of those they'd been taught to fear, their entire world unraveled. In their diaries, later recovered by the Allied translators, phrases repeat like echoes. We were treated with kindness. They covered us with warmth. We cried. That day, no shots were fired in that clearing. No victory flag was raised. Yet, it was perhaps one of the most profound conquests of the entire war. Not of territory, but of belief. The encounter near Haberu did not end the Battle of Okinawa. The fighting raged for months more, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. But from that moment on, American soldiers reported something new, pockets of surrender that came without resistance. Civilians who no longer leapt from cliffs. Nurses who walked out with bandaged soldiers, trusting, cautiously, that mercy was real. And in that cautious trust lay the turning point of something larger, the collapse of fear itself. In the final months of the war, as Okinawa burned and Japan's cities awaited the inevitable, the quiet story of those nurses, and others like them, began to ripple far beyond the battlefield. For both sides, it carried meanings neither command nor propaganda could fully contain. At field hospitals established near captured zones, American medics and doctors treated hundreds of Japanese wounded, men, women, and children. But it was the nurses who drew the most attention. Their surrender had been unthinkable only months earlier, yet now they worked side by side with American staff, helping tend to the injured of both nations. Their presence became living proof that hatred could give way to cooperation. Major Clarence C. Hatch, a medical officer stationed on Okinawa, noted in his report, "These women behaved with dignity, precision, and deep sadness. They did not speak much, but their eyes carried both exhaustion and relief. They seemed astonished that our men showed restraint, that decency could exist in war." The nurses' tears, seen by soldiers hardened by years of fighting, left a mark deeper than the victory banners. It changed how the Americans viewed their own enemy. Hardened Marines, who had seen comrades mutilated and friends lost to banzai charges, began to realize that the enemy was not a single face of fanaticism, but a nation of people misled and consumed by ideology. At the same time, word of these encounters spread quietly among Japanese prisoners of war. Some, captured later in the Philippines and Borneo, recounted that they had heard rumors. American soldiers gave blankets to our nurses, the myth of the merciless enemy, once the strongest weapon of Imperial Japan, began to fracture from within. For the Americans, these moments also became moral anchors amid the chaos. War correspondents who recorded them often described an atmosphere of solemn disbelief, soldiers staring at the people they were ordered to destroy, now tending to them as patients. One nurse, interviewed after the war, said simply, "When I felt the blanket over me, I stopped being a soldier. I was human again." That sentence captures what no victory report could, the moment when humanity reasserts itself through mercy. But even as these small miracles unfolded, the wider world plunged deeper into darkness. The Battle of Okinawa ended with unimaginable loss. Over 12,000 Americans dead, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and roughly the same number of civilians. 2 months later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki would vanish under atomic light. In that context, the image of an American soldier kneeling to comfort a Japanese nurse seems impossibly fragile, a candle against a hurricane. Yet it is precisely in that fragility that its power resides. Because even amid the cruelty of total war, acts of compassion did not disappear. They defied it. The sight of a nurse weeping into the arms of her supposed enemy revealed something neither bomb nor bullet could erase: the instinct to recognize another's pain as one's own. As Japan's government collapsed and the emperor prepared his final broadcast of surrender, that instinct lingered in quiet corners, in field hospitals, in prison camps, in memories whispered between survivors. It became part of the foundation upon which a new peace would one day be built. What began as a moment of disbelief on a battlefield had become something far greater, the first fragile thread of reconciliation between two nations that, months later, would begin to rebuild not through revenge, but through recognition. And when the war finally ended, the story of those nurses, once hidden in diaries and footnotes, would return decades later as one of the few fragments of light left from humanity's darkest chapter. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world stood still, not in celebration, but in exhaustion. Japan was in ruins, entire cities had vanished into ash, and more than 2 million soldiers and civilians were dead. Yet amid the rubble, stories survive, not of victory or conquest, but of mercy. Among them was the quiet tale of the nurses who had once wept beneath American blankets. As Allied occupation forces landed on Japanese soil, they encountered a nation both humbled and haunted. The propaganda that had fueled years of war collapsed overnight. Citizens who had been told to fight to the death now listened to Emperor Hirohito's voice, frail, distant, and human, admitting surrender. To endure the unendurable, he said, was now Japan's duty. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard compassion spoken from authority. American military doctors and nurses became some of the first foreigners allowed to work openly in post-war Japan. They were greeted with a mixture of curiosity and shame. But what surprised them most was how many Japanese medical workers, particularly nurses, approached them not as captors, but as equals. The memory of kindness shown during the final battles had spread quietly, through whispered accounts, through diaries, through the survivors of Okinawa and the Philippines. In 1946, at the U.S. Army's 42nd General Hospital in Yokohama, several former Japanese Army nurses were employed to assist with local civilian care. Some had once served in combat zones against the Americans themselves. Now they bandaged American patients with steady hands. A few even recognized faces, medics who had once treated them. The silence between them spoke louder than any apology. Reports from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, noted that Japanese medical personnel demonstrated remarkable discipline and willingness to cooperate. But behind those words lay something deeper: gratitude. Unspoken, yet unmistakable. One American officer wrote in a letter home, "They bow, we nod." And in that small exchange I feel that maybe this war taught us something after all. That kindness, once given, has a way of surviving. The cultural shift was gradual but undeniable. American humanitarian conduct, even limited as it was, became part of the foundation for Japan's post-war image of the United States. It softened occupation, made collaboration possible, and allowed education and medical reforms to take root faster than in many other defeated nations. Former Japanese nurses began to tell their stories quietly in local journals, often anonymously. They described not only the devastation of war, but also the shock of mercy. "The blanket," one wrote, "felt heavier than armor." That image of warmth after cold, of gentleness after terror, became symbolic in later peace exhibitions held in Okinawa and Hiroshima decades later. In the hospitals and reconstruction centers that followed, American and Japanese nurses worked side by side. They spoke different languages, but they shared the same calling: to heal a world that had nearly destroyed itself. These women, who had once been separated by propaganda and war, now found unity through the same mission that had been twisted by their governments. Healing became their rebellion and their redemption. The war was over, but the memory of mercy had only just begun to spread. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, fragments of humanity preserved through compassion began to resurface like half-buried relics. Letters, diaries, and oral testimonies from both American medics and Japanese nurses started appearing. Some shared in veterans' reunions, others tucked away in family archives. Each account, though personal, told the same quiet truth. Mercy had left a deeper scar than violence. One such testimony came from Corporal George A. Potter, a U.S. Army medic stationed on Luzon. His field notes, now held at the National World War II Museum, described tending to wounded Japanese medical staff after a skirmish near San Manuel. "They trembled as we approached," he wrote. "One nurse hid her face. I thought she was crying from pain, but she was crying from disbelief." Similar stories emerged from Okinawa. Japanese survivors later testified to the International Red Cross that the Americans had given medical aid without cruelty. For many Japanese civilians, these moments shattered years of indoctrination. They no longer saw surrender as dishonor, but as a path back to life. In post-war Japan, These experiences became vital to rebuilding trust. U.S. occupation authorities organized joint nursing programs that paired American and Japanese women in training hospitals. The initiative wasn't just medical, it was psychological. It allowed the defeated and the victorious to meet not as enemies, but as humans sharing the same vocation. By 1948, Japan's nursing schools had begun to adopt Western-style humanitarian ethics. Lectures emphasized the universal duty to preserve life, echoing what many Japanese nurses had learned from American medics in the war's final months. The phrase Jinrui Ai, love for humanity, became a guiding principle in nursing manuals, replacing the wartime codes of loyalty and sacrifice. Meanwhile, American veterans returning home carried their own quiet burden. Some could not reconcile the compassion they'd shown with the destruction they'd caused. They wrote of their guilt, of comforting one Japanese nurse, then marching through villages reduced to ash. Yet, they also wrote of peace, that perhaps their small acts of mercy had been the only things that made sense amid chaos. In later decades, during U.S.-Japan commemorative events, a few surviving nurses met their former captors again, not as enemies, but as colleagues. One elderly nurse from Okinawa, who had been rescued as a young woman in 1945, reportedly clasped the hand of an American veteran and whispered, "I still remember the warmth." He replied, "So do I." These brief exchanges, almost too fragile to belong to history, remind us that the war's end was not written only in surrender documents or court verdicts, but in moments where individuals chose compassion over cruelty. They are the small, unrecorded victories that reshaped both nations. When historians today speak of the Pacific War's legacy, they often cite the devastation: Hiroshima, Nanking, Manila. Yet beneath those towering shadows, the story of the nurses and medics stands apart, a testament to how empathy can survive even inside catastrophe. By the 1960s, when Japan had rebuilt and rejoined the world, peace museums across Okinawa and Tokyo began displaying replicas of those wartime blankets, not as relics of defeat, but as symbols of shared humanity. Visitors would stand before them in silence, reading the inscription placed beneath in both languages. Even enemies can heal one another, and perhaps that is how true peace was born, not through the treaties of generals, but through the trembling hands of those who once feared each other, now united in the oldest duty of humankind, to save life. History often remembers wars by their victors, by the lines on a map, by the signatures on a treaty. But the real victories, the ones that last, are not carved in stone. They are carried quietly in memory. The story of the Japanese nurses and the American medics is one of those victories. It did not win a battle or alter a strategy. It did something rarer. It proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion can still rise through the smoke. For the nurses, that moment when the blanket fell over their shoulders was not only a gesture of kindness. It was the death of a lie. The lie that mercy belonged only to one side, that humanity was a privilege of the victors. Their tears were not surrender. They were awakening. For the medics, it was a reminder that saving life was the truest form of courage. They fought in a war that demanded killing, yet they chose to heal. And in doing so, they reclaimed a fragment of the world that war tried to destroy. Long after the bombs stopped and the flags were folded, the warmth of that moment remained. It passed from one generation to the next, not through textbooks or ceremonies, but through something deeper, the quiet understanding that empathy is a weapon stronger than hate. Because when an American soldier knelt beside a defeated nurse, when steel met skin not to wound but to heal, the war momentarily lost its power. In that instant, humanity, fragile, imperfect, but enduring, won. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Pacific War, that the greatest acts of victory are not measured by conquest or surrender, but by compassion that survives them both.